Hello and good evening or afternoon, wherever you may be. I am Jamie Dobson, the founder of Container Solutions and the host of this podcast, The Cloud Native Attitude.
And I'm Ian Miell, partner at Container Solutions, and I work with Jamie solving cloud problems.
And this is the bit where I tell you to follow us on LinkedIn for more updates, but since I can't be bothered to do that, I reckon we're going to go straight into the meat of this podcast. Welcome, Ian. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. I've not been trapped on a train. Nobody's been murdered on the Orient Express. And actually, the sun's shining where I am. What's it like where you are?
Well, I'm not that far from you, Jamie. I'm only a couple of miles
No, that's true. Yeah,
in the city.
It's close enough.
Yeah.
It's close enough if you don't mind. Right, so today we're still in chapter one of the Cloud Native Attitude, but it's a pretty important chapter. And we're going to be speaking about context, which is, of course, the one thing we all learn on day one of computer programming school. The answer to the question is, Ian, it
Context.
depends.
Oh, right. It depends.
The
Yeah.
answer to the answer to every question for consultants and computer programmers is that it depends, and it depends on
Context.
context, 100%. So we're going to be doing three things again. The first thing is we're going to be talking about context and what happens when you misdiagnose it. This is a general framework, and a huge shout out to Amy Edmondson, who appears for the first time in this podcast. Not as a person, unfortunately, we couldn't book her, but just as a in spirit, because I'm going to be reading from one of her books. Now, the second thing, and much more related to the work we do on a day-to-day basis, is organisations. Are you a startup, a scale-up, or an enterprise? This is the key sort of diagnostic criteria that we want to get into today. And then the third thing is that along the way, we're going to be sharing anecdotes of startups that we've experienced, scale-ups that we've looked at, and of course, in your case, Ian, some whopping enterprises, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
they
right.
include, I mean, what's your favourite industry in tech? When it comes to whopping industries, which one was the most fun for
Well,
you?
I worked in fintech for 5 years. One company was 130,000 people, and another was much smaller. I don't know how much smaller, but tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands.
130,000 people. That is a medium-sized northern town, or it's a one
It's
borough of London.
yeah. I used to say to people it was like moving to another country. So you have to go and you have to go to somewhere to get the passport and get the picture and all that bureaucratic stuff. It's like this had its own bureaucracy. That's the way I.
I'll never forget when I worked at Accenture. I loved it. Whatever you wanted just appeared. Needed a computer, needed a car, needed a plane ticket. Poof, just appeared. I was in my mid-20s, and I thought I would hate it. And actually, that part of the work I loved.
Well, that was a long time ago, wasn't it, Jamie? I think now it's much bigger, isn't it?
Very long time ago. That's true. I was at Accenture just as they sort of escaped the gravitational pull of Arthur Anderson. You remember those guys?
I do. I do. Friends of mine work for them.
We have now digressed. So, to remind the reader, three things: context, what type of organisation do you work for, and third thing, plenty of stories from Ian and I. Now, Ian, I'm about to tell you a story. Now, I know you don't know this story, and I'm pretty sure that maybe only 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 of our listeners have heard it as well. Do you know what the story's about?
I don't until you tell me.
I'm going to tell you now. It's true. I've not told you. It's called the electric maze, right? So this appears, the idea of the electric maze appears in chapter 6 of Amy Edmondson's latest book, Why Learning to Fail Can Teach Us to Thrive, right? Now imagine electric maze. It's like a chessboard. Handful of squares by a handful of squares. Let's say 7 by 7. I could look that up, but it's something like that. 7 by 7 or 6 by 8. And it's big. It's as big as a room. And as a team, your job, you and your colleagues, you try to imagine me on the starting line and yourself and maybe James and David. And we have got a very simple job. We have got to get to the other side of the electric maze. Except the problem is some of the squares beep. And they don't beep like beep. They're like, it's a proper loud beep. Beep. And sort of everybody jumps out of their skin. Now, whoever's on the game, if they discover a square that beeps, they have to go back to the back of the queue and then their colleague, tries again. And obviously when they get to that square, they step over it and they continue until eventually a path between the beginning of the maze and the back end of the maze has been discovered. Now, what do you think happens, Ian, when people try this for themselves? How do you think it
Well,
goes down?
well, I'm immediately thinking about two things: Squid Game and Deal or No Deal. So so you're describing a situation where you no one knows which way is the right way to go, right? No one
That's
knows.
correct. Yeah.
So you may as well just pick one and see what happens, right?
So I don't know anything about Deal or No Deal or Squid Game, so you might need to enlighten me.
I'm quite amazed. You don't know about
Well,
either of those things.
I don't watch much telly. I read too many books.
Okay, Squid Game's going to be the one that probably appeals to the most listeners, or is known by the most listeners. So there is Squid Game is a series of games played by people who are under threat of being killed, and
Right,
there is a game within that game where they have to cross this glass bridge, and on the glass bridge you have at each point a choice of two panels to walk onto.
right.
But one of the panels will drop you down into whatever the crocodiles at the bottom, and the other one is keeps you safe. And what happens in that is that people agonize about which panel to go on, even though they don't know which one is the correct one.
Well, okay, so I swear to God, I've never seen Squid Game, but I cannot believe you've given me that as an example. Because what should happen in Electric Maze is that people should methodically work their way through the maze. Now, if you're a computer programmer, you know that this is a brute force algorithm. You simply try everything until you find the path. There is no shortcut through it because we don't have any hints as to where the beeps are. Brute force requires no thinking, and in fact, it requires no emotions whatsoever. All we need to do is make a mental note of where the beeps are, and every time it beeps, calmly step off, and our colleagues come forward. And of course, that is rationally what you should do. And if a bunch of container solutions engineers were doing this test, including with me, I hope that we would be calm and rational. What actually happens is people behave like it's Squid Game. So they take the first few steps and then their leg hovers over the fourth step and people are sort of on tenterhooks looking on, and if it beeps, everybody sort of jumps, panics, and then breathes some sort of mad sigh of relief, and then they try again. Now, unbelievably, it is this emotional roller coaster that they go on, but that they put themselves on because they're scared of failure, because they think, like in Squid Game, they might fall through and get eaten. But in Electric Maze, that doesn't happen. So somehow, people, it's human nature, change a simple, rational search for beeping squares into an agonising roller coaster of anxiety, relief, sometimes a bit of panic, and then when you finally get to the end, whoops of joy. But of course, you only get to the end after about 16, 17 minutes. So we somehow managed to change a 6 or 7 minute task into a 17 or 18-minute task. That's Electric Maze.
And that's what we see with our customers all the time, isn't it? They're terrified of making a mistake, and they think that there is a correct way to do things that they're not aware of. And the first thing we often get asked is, "What's the right thing to do?"
That's right.
And we often have to say, like, if anyone knows, you know, because you know your context better than us. But we've got the experience of going through that maze before and knowing that the quickest way is to go and see.
Exactly. So basically, Amy Edmondson in chapter 6 talks about consistent context and novel context. Now, in software, we've got a few nuances. We have simple on one end of the spectrum, and we have chaotic on the other, where we really act first before we do anything. So we tend to diagnose context in a little bit more details in software development and infrastructure development. But ultimately, you've hit the nail on the head. On the one end, where you find consistency, you're in execution mode. So running a payroll is completely algorithmic, etc., etc. So if you
Well defined. Yeah.
yeah, it's well defined. Now, searching for the right cloud infrastructure and iterating based on user feedback, your web scale applications or your mobile applications, is something more novel. However, what isn't novel is the algorithm by which we work step by step through the maze. So what tends to happen is, in exactly the same way companies create a chaotic and an emotional roller coaster of an electric maze, they have got a knack of changing what are pretty straightforward steps along the electric maze of cloud native and changing what to us is pretty standard work into an emotional roller coaster for themselves.
That's right. Yeah. What you're talking about there, was it simple and novel? What was the two?
So Edmondson talks about novelty on one end of a
Mhm.
spectrum and consistency on the other. Now,
Consistency.
yeah,
Yeah, so that reminds me a lot of something I talk about a lot with our clients. Uh, Kinefin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
no, nobody knows how to. Isn't it funny? Nobody knows how to pronounce kinefin, like nobody knows how to pronounce Bezos. So we've done that now two
Yeah, yeah.
podcasts in a row.
Hard problems in computing is the third one is pronouncing things correctly. Um, so Kinefin um, divides things up into I think uh, five categories: simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, and uh, I can't remember what the fifth one is, but it's a weird one.
I think in the middle it's disordered, totally
Disordered.
disordered. Yeah,
That's the one. Disordered.
and Kinefin, for the benefit of our readers, was developed by a guy called Dave Snowden. I know Dave, great guy, by the way. And once upon a time, that paper he wrote for the Harvard Business Review was the most downloaded paper and something like the most quoted paper they'd ever had. Now, I don't know if that's true. It came out in 2007, but certainly we'll share the link to that Harvard Business Review article because it is an extremely useful framework.
It is, and what's so powerful about it is often we're talking to people and we're talking at cross purposes. So they're sort of saying, "What is the answer? What is the answer?" And we have to explain to them, "Look, there are these five contexts that people can be in, and because you're in an organization which has been successful up till now in a certain way, you have a standard recipe for success. So you're in the simple or complicated situation, but you're moving into a situation that is either complex or chaotic. You don't know what the right step is. No one knows what the right step is. Your business hasn't done this before. Your context is entirely new. And so you need to, there are appropriate ways to act when the situation is simple. You document, you train, you optimize, and there are appropriate ways to act when you're in a completely novel situation, like you're trying to build cloud native in a cloud native way for your business. Then you need to act in a more experimental way and reduce the cost of experimentation. All these things that we talk about and help guide people through. I mean,
That's
I should
right.
say that there are things that we know about, like technologies and tools which can save a bit of time. But it's that mindset that really
So
gets
yeah,
people.
exactly. So to give some examples from Kinefit, so something that is simple might be fixing a bike tire. You know what you need to do. You know what the steps are. But even something like flying an aeroplane or doing heart surgery follows certain checklists because heart surgery is a known problem. All of the experimentation was done decades ago. So now it would be a bit weird if your surgeon turned up and said, "Well, we're gonna iterate our way through this heart procedure." Straight away you'd say, "I need a different doctor." So when you're on the simple sort of end of that it's not really a spectrum, but when you diagnose your context as simple, it's all about ready, aim, fire. Right?
Mhm.
We all know that expression. It's a military expression. We all played these silly games when we were children, ready, aim, fire. But as soon as some things become about searching and learning as you go, it's all about fire, ready, aim. So by acting, by doing something, you learn about the context, and therefore you can make a better aim the next move you make. So electric maze is smart because it's about step by step process, I should say. But interestingly enough, this is what's funny: is even though you don't know where you're going, there's still no reason to be afraid. Because actually, if you make a so-called quote unquote misstep, there is no shame involved in that. And I think if we're going to be honest, why do people get so anxious with electric maze and anxious to succeed with the cloud? It's because the fear of failure, in other words, by the way, the fear of shame, is so powerful that people want to avoid it at almost all costs.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So now, where does it go wrong? So now we're going to pivot, Ian. By the way, I never used to use the word pivot unless I was in a physics class, and I hate the word pivot, but somehow it's leaked into my lexicography. We're going to pivot now because we want to talk about different contexts. Companies that are starting up, companies that are scaling up, and big enterprises who were trying to learn, the most about cloud. And the reason this is important is because it usually goes wrong for companies when they misdiagnose the context. So in general, if you think that cloud native is some sort of execution process with a tick box, like heart surgery, you're going to be greatly mistaken. If, however, you think it's a journey of discovery, that every time a square beeps, you pause, you learn, you make some notes, you discuss with your colleagues before taking your next step, then you're on the right track. However, saying this and knowing this is extremely different to pulling it off in the real world.
Certainly is. Absolutely.
I'm going to start, Ian, with startups. Now,
Okay.
there are two types of startups, and it's not a trick question. It's not a trick question. It's a real question, and in our world, it's extremely real. What are the two types of startup? I've got
Well,
you. I've got him, everybody.
successful ones and non-successful ones.
Well, that's true. Yeah, the graveyard of failed startups is way bigger than the startups that make it through. No, actually, in our world, what's really important is there is the startup, the tabula rasa, the blank slate, and I think Starling Bank is a good example of that. They used AWS, and the engineers at Starling and the chief technology officer Greg will tell you, knowing what he knows now, he'd have done things differently. Yeah, well, yeah, of course. Technologies have changed, and the processes and methods we used to use back then have evolved and become something different. But then you have a startup that escapes from an enterprise. Now, you might have heard these referred to as skunk works. A
Hmm.
skunk works is when you grab a room or a building and you do something away from the main sort of headquarters of your business. But a starburst, I think, is slightly different. A starburst is when you complete a brand new company. So it's like you're a supernova and some sort of shooting star flies out. So a new legal entity, different people, different rules, and they attempt to do something from scratch.
Right. So I'm interested in that distinction. So skunkworks comes from the aviation industry, doesn't it? The
Yeah, it
defense
comes from
aviation.
Lockheed Martin. Yeah, that's right.
So they got a bunch of engineers and they gave them a separate air hangar or whatever, and told them you don't have to follow the rules everyone else does. I think Steve Jobs probably did a similar thing at Apple with his designers. Said all those bureaucratic rules about getting resources and so on, forget it. You just do what you have to do to get this project up and running. And that became known as skunkworks because of the smell that came from it.
They called it skunkworks because they told everybody back in headquarters or the main building, don't go near that building. A skunk's escaped. It absolutely stinks. So that
Right,
was where the. So I don't know if that is a myth now, or but that was the vibe. But the idea was that if you're from payroll or HR or anywhere, do not go and speak to those people. And in a way, it comes from what we discussed in our last podcast. Jeff Bezos running around Amazon saying, uh, developers are the new alchemists. They have to be allowed to do their alchemy. The idea behind the skunk works was we need mavericks to do cutting edge research, and we need to leave them alone so they can do their mavericking. Now, mavericking is a verb I just made up, but I think you know what I mean.
so the starburst is actually an entirely separate entity. Is that what you're
It's an
saying?
entirely separate entity, and I've got a few really good examples of how it goes wrong for, let's call them starbursts or enterprise startups. And it goes something like this. So many years ago, and I'm not going to say in which country or which bank this was, people were threatened, felt really threatened by the emerging digital first challenger banks. Now, obviously, the people most equipped to succeed in cloud would have been the existing financial institutions, insurance companies, pensions, and all of that. And one of these really large ones, multi-billion pound jobby, was like, right, we cannot innovate within in the bank. And every time we try to do anything that looks like electric maze, we never get past the first three squares because the anxiety and the fear and the amount of sign-offs we have to get before we're even allowed to make a step on our cloud native electric maze is so vast that nothing is getting done. And at exactly the same time as that was happening, companies like Container Solutions, we were writing open source software, we were getting people to the cloud in 6 weeks initially, and then we were scaling out and ramping up their platforms. We were, in other words, succeeding. So they started to realise there's something about this place. It's the rules, it's the procedures, and if we could just uncouple ourselves from those rules and those procedures, we will succeed.
So that reminds me of how I got into Kubernetes. So uh, Kubernetes was a product that I helped put into production at a major bank in 2016, and it had exponential growth. Every 3 months, it doubled its number of users. And you might think that's because I was an awesome engineer and architect, and me and my colleagues did amazing work. I hope that's true. But actually, when we talked to people, why are you using this? They said, because it takes 6 weeks for us to get a VM and it costs us a lot of money to get a VM. Whereas we can onboard with you in a day and it costs us almost nothing. And that was why they were using us, because they could do quick experiments to see if a product would work for them.
So, see, you hit the jackpot there because you found a use case and
Exactly.
you created value within your firewall. Right, okay. So back to the starburst then. So the hypothesis is that there's something about this place that makes us misdiagnose our context and makes us scared of making forward progress or whatever. All we do know is that it's impossible to spin up some sort of cloud infrastructure and challenge the emerging challenger banks around us. Now, this typically went one of two ways. So the first bank that I saw do this did the following. They took all of the best engineers. Now, this is a bit of a mistake because what happened is the rail bank, the parent bank, needed those engineers. They took the best engineers and the best managers, gave them, I don't know, did they give them credit cards or they gave them AWS accounts and all of that? No problem. So they start to build infrastructure. But then when we took a look, it was heavy infrastructure, heavily secure, lots of guardrails. And we were like, well, have you put anything in the hands of a user yet? Oh, no, 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 no. Even a beta user, test user, students? No, 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 no. Nothing's got in the hands of users. Now, needless to say, this was a complete failure. They eventually did get something in the hands of actual customers, no problem. And then when they scaled up to 1,000, their Amazon bill went through the roof. And what they'd done by taking with them the same people and the same managers who may or may have been the best in headquarters, they'd taken with them the same mindset. So iterating and testing and learning simply didn't work. And so that startup failed because they couldn't act in the iterative and interactive way that is central to the success with cloud and cloud native.
Yes. So we see that with many of our clients, right? Is that they're used to. In fact, that's what I was talking about earlier. They were used to thinking in a certain way, and they just applied that context to this other place. If you imagine, I suppose it's like if you imagine taking a football team and showing them a new game that was different, they'd still act like a football team for a while
Yeah,
before they figured out, oh, this is a different
yeah, that's
challenge.
right.
This is a different context we're in.
And since you've mentioned football teams, how is it that football teams play in a certain style, even though none of the players there were there 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago? And it's because that mindset is contagious. New people come in. Um, and so if you want a radically different solution or a radically different way of doing business or doing computing, you need to have a different mindset.
And that comes from leadership, right? Which we've
That
talked
that
about
comes from
before.
leadership. Now that
Yeah.
brings me up to my next point, a success case. Now I've got in front of me an article. It's from Sifted and it's from about 5 years ago. In fact, it's almost from exactly 5 years ago, January 27, 2020. And this is the dual story of a bank called Metal, which was a starburst, and a bank called Bo. And I will share the link in the comments. But the long story, or the short version, I should say, is that Bo Bank really, really struggled to sort of succeed. And then one morning, quite unbelievably, really, a message was sent to both users and staff to say that the decision has been made to, fold the bank. It was a very, very expensive failure for its parent bank, and I do believe its parent bank was let me just check the article, was the Royal Bank of Scotland. Now, in the same article, they interview a lady called Marika Flamant. She was the then chief executive of Metal. Now, as far as I can tell, Metal are doing quite well. And she says something that I think is really interesting. And she says, well, we approach this differently. We viewed ourselves as a technology company first and a bank second. And so I think what she meant by that is we understood that the nature of cutting edge research, the context was completely novel, was going to have to be iterative. They needed to speak to the users. And actually, they then went on to succeed in the way I guess NatWest, which was their parent company, would have hypothesized.
So to challenge you a bit there, what did the Royal Bank of Scotland do wrong then? Because we've been talking about failure as it should be embraced, and you're saying Bowbank was a big expensive failure. So what did RBS do wrong and Metal do right?
Well, that's what other than the chief executive, in this case Marika, framing the problem as a technology problem.
Yeah.
Well, so in the article, now I don't want to misquote, but the four biggest issues that are sort of quoted as being the reason why RBS struggled was number one, politics. Now I'm guessing this is back at a time when RBS had been nationalised.
Hmm.
Poor user feedback. So when it came out in the Apple Store, it was really sort of hammered. And obviously, people don't like applications, do they, from whether it's from the Play Store or the Apple Store, that don't quite, are not quite fit for purpose. And then the other one was technical flaws, mistakes and missteps. It was plagued with problems that they couldn't sort of overcome. And those are the three key reasons given in the article.
So is there a more fundamental difference, which is that when you test and learn, you need to start small, and it sounds like Bowbank had big ambitions from the start, and
Yes, but
and
that would be to assume that NatWest didn't have big ambitions for metal, and I think that's patently not the case. I think you're on the right track. I think the prize is massive, but how to get there is by slowly stepping through your electric maze of cloud native, learning as you go, questioning, doing failure analysis again. It's good old fashioned failure analysis. If something
Mm.
blows up in production, you have a safe, sensible discussion, learn your lessons, and put in checks to make sure they don't happen again. So I think Metal, by the looks of it, had an extremely ambitious goal, but the process by which they got there was different to some of those other bigger banks, like the one I mentioned at the start of the podcast, that were struggling.
Right, yeah. So their tactics were the strategy. Well, the goal was the same for both, but for Metal, they were getting there through short iterative learning steps that were learned from.
Well, I can't honestly answer that question because I don't know. But reading between the lines of the article, you get the feeling that yes is the answer to that
Well,
question.
I worked for a company like that aimed to be like a Starburst or a Skunkworks. It wasn't actually a separate entity, but it was separate within the business. Anyway, um, for a bank. So I worked for a US bank, building a cloud native platform, and all the engineers were saying the same thing, which was we need to start small and learn our
Right,
lessons and move up.
right,
But the senior leadership said, no, we've told Wall Street we're going to be cloud native in 2 years, and we've
right.
hired you, so just do it. And everyone at a higher level was thinking big and thinking we've got to get huge data centers and we've got to do this and we've got to pay
Yeah.
these companies millions of pounds for their licenses because we're going to use them, we're going to go massive. And we all said, no, no, we need to start small, learn how this works, and move on.
I
But
mean,
it was just missold to everyone.
literally, I wrote a book about this cloud native transformation. Well, I helped write a book, is much more accurate to say, actually. And the most important pattern in the book, or one of the most important, is to have a vision. That's the 2 year thing. And then to build a core team, build
Hmm.
safety, normalize failing, because you can't learn if you're not allowed to fail and learn those lessons. And we might get there in 2 years. And the best way to stack the odds in your favor is to do this. Learn as you go, learn to learn and build up to it. And then you start to accelerate. Typically, it's a fact actually, it's a heuristic. Rapid accelerations and ramp ups are always followed by humiliating ramp downs when you fire your rocket directly into a brick wall.
Yeah.
I'm sick of this. I get two pieces of feedback all the time. We need to get this right at the beginning. We need to work from scale from the beginning. That's absolutely incorrect. And then when I'm very calm, because I've got my electric maze hat on, I get feedback, ooh, you don't seem switched on enough, you don't seem urgent enough. And I'm like, well, you're panicking. And so
Mm.
this is a clash. And I think when we work with customers who understand those two ideas, that we have to keep calm, we have to start small and start to get some victories behind us, and then ramp up, learning to learn, then it goes well. But I think the challenge for us as consultants is we get asked to join contexts that really need the cloud, but unfortunately they're just not quite ready to learn those lessons of scalability and those lessons of moving step by step.
But we do have to emphasize the pace of the learning cycle. We can't be relaxed about the amount of time we
No.
spend learning the lessons. So it's about optimizing that loop to be as
So
short as possible.
absolutely. So we use software, and we say that it's okay to fail, or it's okay to make a mistake. It's not okay to make the same mistake twice. And we say
Mm.
that, there's a blameworthy mistake where you've obviously been sloppy. That's going to lead to a managerial conversation. And then, of course, there's a praiseworthy failure where you've tried to experiment, for example, with an A/B test, or one of those didn't turn out how you quite liked. So the toolkit of learning to learn is actually
It's
massive
very
and
hard to get that
complex.
across in an organization, isn't it? Because people hear it's okay to fail, so I can just do what I like.
Oh my God, I once had a manager when I was very, very young. I gave him my whole "it's okay to fail" speech, and I expect you to create safety for other people to fail. Then he was late for work because he decided to take a train, and he said, "Well, it's okay. You said it's okay to fail." And remarkably, I would have an answer for that person now, and the answer would be, "Get the fuck out of my office. You're fired." But unbelievably, I engaged with this person. I mean, we're going back many years now, measured in decades, but I didn't have an answer. And the problem with, cultures of uh, a failure where it's safe to fail is they're easy to exploit if the manager, which was me in that case, does not understand how to manage and lead in such an environment.
Mm.
Now, coming back to this article, Ian. So, uh, uh, Marika Flamant, who I just mentioned, she said, and this is a quote from the article, the biggest challenge is that they're two different cultures, Metal and RBS. Our way of working is more like a tech company than a bank. And I'm reading between the lines there that indeed they are taking stepwise, they're following a stepwise process into the unknown. And then there's a quote from Anne Bowden, who of course is famously the founder of Starling Bank. And then she said, I came from that world. If I thought I was going to be able to create what I have done, uh, it's very difficult to replicate the energy and technology of a startup. So I think what Anne's saying there is the vision she had, digital first, cloud first, moving quickly, responding to users, was more or less impossible in the world from which she had sort of exited.
Right, yeah, and I have my own theories on how to change those things based on the what I call the money flows around an
Right.
organization. But we won't get into that today because I think that would that would take a lot of time. But just
That
very briefly, I suspect Metal had a different patron structure. So I suspect that Metal were given money, given funds with a different criteria than RBS.
almost certainly, yeah, yeah. So they were set up for success. I think that's an important point of the starbursts. Righto. So we've done startups to death. At least we've done starbursts to death.
Hmm.
For those who really want to understand how the cloud is used to start up a business, I reckon it's worth tuning into the last podcast and listening to the Amazon story. Now let's talk about scale ups. So scale ups are very useful, or actually, I'll reverse that. Cloud native as a set of processes, technologies, and leadership styles is very useful for companies that are scaling up.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Um, my experience, my very early experience, came from the travel industry, and Holiday Check in fact, was the very first customer of Container Solutions. And when we crossed paths with them, they were in the middle of sort of making that transition. I suppose, like many travel agents, you used to go into a travel agent's, look at a brochure, and then book it right there on the high street. Do you even remember those days, Ian?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I remember looking through the brochures and getting them from the travel agent. It's a different world, isn't it?
exciting. And actually, when the travel agent booked it for you, they would have done it by logging into a timesharing computer. And at the end of the month, they'd have got a bill. Well, so that was the sort of time I met Holiday Check. But at the time, we were working with many people in the travel industry. And what we learned is, of course, cloud technologies back then were not exactly like they are now. But what we learned is as more and more customers were going online, searching for what they wanted without using the travel agents, this was almost growing exponentially. 1,000 users became 2,000, and it became a whole new market for the sort of travel agents and, of course, airline companies. And interestingly, I'll never ever forget this for as long as I live. One of the meetings we had with one of our friends in the travel industry, they will remain nameless, was with their executive team. Nothing was happening in development, and I'd had a lot of experience building web scale applications for a big airline. In fact, I've written extensively about that. So they brought me in to try to help. And sure enough, we got to a point where nobody would make any moves. They did not travel down their electric maze. They would not automate their continuous build systems, and everybody was really, really frightened. And I couldn't understand, because when I met the engineers, they were all friendly, they were all capable. They all had lots of proof of concepts where they had some A/B testing and they clicked on one button versus another. So they were all geared up for this to work. Had no idea what was happening. I finally met the person who was in charge. The person who was in charge had come from a different world, a world of TV advertisements running at the halftime at football, a world where you ramped up your spend in January when everybody was fed up. And when I say spend, I mean your advertisement spend, posters, TV commercials. And of course, the TV commercials had to be synchronized with the printing of brochures. And so therefore, this person asked me to drive all of the risk out of the development process, give them a plan. He said, for God's sakes, man, give me a plan that tells me how much money you're going to spend, what web features you're going to deliver, and how I might be able to tie them into a commercial on TV. And I was like, oh boy, how do I begin to explain the context of web applications? He also wanted a plan for the design. And I said to him, well, most modern web applications are designed through A/B testing, which is shit if you're a designer, right? In the old days, we used to do user stories and mock-ups. The world of user interface design was really exciting. And at one point, it was all just A/B tested to death. And a lot of designers just shrugged their shoulders and left. Famously, the head of design at Google left because they used A/B testing to work out the right colour of blue when you clicked on the link. So before you clicked, it was a certain colour. After you clicked, it changed colour. A/B testing proved which was the, quote, right one, and the designer was like, oh, fuck this, I'm out of here.
Well, that sounds like evolution versus design, right? I mean, literally, that's how evolution works. It's blind. It doesn't care about the long-term goal or what you know about the context. It just says this got more votes than that, or had more children than that. Therefore,
That's right.
that one wins. And over a long enough period, you get what looks like design.
Well, and of course, when you've got thousands or millions of users, that's exactly how design does work when on the web or with mobile apps.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was the context I stepped into. So it was a really difficult situation because clearly cloud technologies or heavy automation and all of that would help scale that business. It would open up users exactly like it was opening up users for Amazon and for Netflix, users that would never think to use that travel agent. And the person in charge didn't want to accelerate as all around them, Booking.com and all those rivals were eating their breakfast.
So it wasn't a scale up, but I saw exactly the same thing at a bank. So I worked in a cloud in 2016, working on the Kubernetes. It was part of a cloud adoption team. It was about 20, 30 people in this bank. And we had to deal with the traditional project management organization, the PMO structure. And there was someone, and we know who that person is because he works with us now, Jamie, whose job it was. He delivered in the past at this bank, and he'd helped build this cloud adoption team. His job, almost all day, every day, was arguing with PMOs or translating our agile plans to
Right.
PMO plans. So the PMO plans had to be like, what will you do in 3 months? How much will it cost? What will you do in 6 months? How much will it cost? In 12 months, where will it be? And everyone knew it was fiction. Everyone knew that what we were saying we were going to deliver in a year's time bore no relationship to the actual reality. But we still had to go through this process. And his job
Complete.
was
Yeah.
he was just translator. He would take our agile plans and turn them into things that looked okay to the PMO structure. It was madness.
Total theatrics, total business theatrics. But going back to the top of this podcast, when we spoke about Amy Edmondson and the context, you've got an execution context coming from the PMO office, and you've got an agile iterative process in development. And now we're playing games to keep one team off the other's back.
Hmm.
Right. Okay. We're coming to the end of this podcast now. Let's just start to summarize, if you don't mind. So first of all, the startups. What is a startup trying to do? It's trying to find users, right? Well, no, not every startup. The startups that we were associated with, that is to say startups that are building web scale applications or potentially web scale applications. So that's true whether you're a real startup like Starling Bank once was, or you're a Starburst. The mistake that the first bank we discussed made was that they tried to put guardrails in security, and they forgot that they were meant to be hunting users. So tip number one, if you're starting up, it's about users. So when you are building your cloud infra and your web application, make sure you prioritize users. Does that make sense, Ian?
Yes, yes. I don't know if I'm jumping on your points coming up,
You
but
go ahead and jump, baby.
um, understanding context was another thing. Understand the context you're in is another point that we talked about earlier. And it reminds me, and I'm thinking of that story about the goldfish. You know, the goldfish, one goldfish passes another and says, the water's great today. And the other one goes, what's water? Meaning, if you've been in a context for a long time, you can't see a different way to behave. You can't
No,
see a different way to be because
you,
your context is changing around
no,
you and
you
you're
don't
not aware
see
of it.
it. You don't see it. Very famously in 1985, Intel was in a crisis, and at the time, Gordon Moore and Andy Grove was running it. And Grove said to Moore, "If we were fired, if the board fired us, what would the new people who were coming in do?" And then Gordon Moore answered the question, and Grove said, "Well, let's just do that then." And it's because you need an outside perspective. Right, so sticking to back to the scale up. So scale up is about seeking users. Don't forget that context. If that's where you are, if you've diagnosed your context as being that of a scale up, as that of a startup, I should say, it's about users. Now, if you're scaling up, it's it's probably happened that you have those users, and now they start to become more demanding on the one hand, and they start to tell their friends. So you're going to go from 100 users to 200 users to 400 users. So this really is about growing your systems alongside your core offering. So whether that's putting it in observability, I'm not going to say putting in security because, you know, actually I've screwed that up. I've said that wrong. I, I think it's about right sizing your systems as you grow, Ian. So if
Absolutely.
you,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, so once you've got your users, obviously you're going to put the right amount of usability and security and observability from the beginning. But as those users on board, you're going to scale more until you go from what Netflix were circa 2008 to what Netflix were 2018 with Chaos Monkeys and all that kind of stuff.
Many people think that you have to start with the final, the end goal, the end solution. And business has so many pressures on it. You have to evolve and you have to find a path from where you are now to where you want to be. And you don't just jump there. You have to navigate that maze.
You've got
Um,
to navigate the maze. So that's true in every one of these business contexts, scale up, startup, enterprise. You must navigate the maze. Period. It is a
mm,
learning. That the day that cloud computing and computer programming stop being an exercise in learning is the day I'll retire.
mhm.
So the electric maze, nobody can get away from that. Do not change a simple stepwise process into the future into an emotional roller coaster. Now, here's the kicker of this podcasting, and this is going to blow you away. Enterprises, right? What is what if you're an enterprise and you want to consolidate your gains? What does that context tell you should do next? Sure, you should understand it's a learning process, and sure, you should choose the right tools and try to learn how to learn to fail. But the only way you're going to do that is probably by a bit of training, a bit of teaching, and ultimately altering the profile of the type of people that you're going to hire and onboard into your
Well,
organization.
as you were talking, I had a bit of an aha moment, which was leaders create the context.
Leaders
So
do
if you
create the
and you
context.
talked about Intel, by having that thought experiment, if we were fired, what would the new leaders do? They said,
Yeah,
well, we'll do that. They're actually creating a new context. They're sitting in their own context going, we can't change too much because, we've invested all this, we've got the sunk cost, we've got this, we've got that, we've got the other. We've always worked like that. But if they came in fresh, they would do this. And it's like they need to set up the situation for the new context to thrive, the new system to thrive. And that's probably what Metal did correctly. They created the right context, whether that's through words,
yeah.
money, environment, whatever.
So I wasn't going to mention this, but now you've brought it up. I've triggered a thought in you, and you've triggered a thought in me. In Amy Edmondson's other book, her first book, The Fearless Organisation, it's clear, research makes it extremely clear that the leader matters. Their non-verbal communication, the way in Bob Taylor's case, Bob Taylor was legendary head of research at Xerox PARC that went on to invent the computers we know it, the personal computer. Taylor used to change what he called the class one argument into a class two argument. So he would basically have people who were arguing with each other, he'd get them to talk about the thing. And the only way for them to talk about the design decisions the other person made was to get into that other person's head. So the leader has an outsized impact on the ability to create a context where it's okay to fail as you go. So Andy Grove was right, which means how many banks here in London where we live can seriously succeed in the world of cloud computing or indeed in the emerging world of artificial intelligence with the same leadership in place? It's a fair question. Now, if we go back to my travel agent example, what do we think happened to the leadership of those companies that used to print brochures and run TV commercials? They eventually saw the writing on the wall, left, or were unceremoniously dropped by the board of directors.
Evolution doing its work.
Oof, that's a harsh way. That's a harsh way of putting it. But ultimately, it is true. If what you said is correct, that leaders create context. I typically call it framing things. By the way, I tell my students and the people I coach, you need to frame this in a way that your team can solve it. But if you're right, Ian, that this is about leadership framing the context so that people can succeed, then ultimately we're back to, in an enterprise, if you want to become cloud native and you've never done it before, diagnosing any challenges or leadership gaps that you might have and closing them ASAP.
And perhaps making your ambitions more realistic. If you can't change your context, if you can't get rid of your security function and the constraints they impose on you, then you have to be more realistic about what you can achieve.
Yeah, there's the film High Fidelity with John Cusack. I won't go into the gory details, but it's in his teenage years and he's kissing his girlfriend and she rejects him. And then he tries something, let's say more adventurous than a kiss. And in the film he says, it's like asking to borrow $20, and when the person says no, then asking for 100. Now, amazingly, this is a totally normal dynamic in executives who run the businesses that I cross paths with. They set ambitions ridiculously high, way out of the reach of their people, fail to meet them, and then increase the scope and ambitions of their goals, rather than reducing the goals into something that their organisation can succeed with and that they're going to get energy from. And I think this really betrays a massive lack of understanding with human nature. People need to succeed in order to build momentum, in order to succeed further. If you ask me to run 100 metres in 20 seconds, I can do it. Especially if you say you're going to buy me my dinner, I could do it. If you tell me run 100 metres in 11 or 12 seconds, there's no way. So I'm not even going to try. So there is a relationship between the ambitiousness of a goal and a person's willingness to even attempt to do it. And we see such crazy ambitions for the cloud. There's no wonder that hundreds of people in tens of teams simply cross their hands and go, nah, that's not for us.
Yeah, the frozen middle.
The frozen middle. Now, on that happy note, Ian, I am happy to report that the next time you and I meet on this podcast, we are going to be talking about technology. Specifically, we're going to be talking about, you've got to tell me now.
Containers.
Correct. Yes, correct.
Yeah, containers, where they came in, how they came in, what they did to the industry, and how they helped facilitate what we now call cloud native.
How they help facilitate cloud native, and how, of course, they gave birth to a company that we went on to call Container Solutions. On that happy note, but I call it Container Solutions. There's a joke around the Container Solutions name, but that's going to be for the next podcast. So, Ian, thank you for joining me today. Enjoy the sun in London, and I'll see you next week.
Bye, Jamie.
Bye.